Hello and welcome back to the Lib Dem Podcast. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking life's still a little bit miserable after the general election. But why are Labour going for a very dour, downbeat and miserable kind of approach to their politics? We're going to get into that, why they're doing that strategy, whether it's working or not, whether the Lib Dems will benefit, or maybe where the other parties could capitalise. So my name is John Potter. I am the host of the Lib Dem Podcast, and I'm in my new Leader of the Opposition office on Preston City Council. And joining us today, we have Sam Al-Hamdani from the old Lib Dems, a new worker for a parliamentarian. Congratulations on the job, Sam.
Thank you very much. Pleasure working for Lisa Smart.
Yes, well, we'll see if that still holds up. She's not going to be on the podcast as much now, so Sam will be able to get away with saying whatever he wants. And joining us is now part of our permanent team is Neil Alexander from Elgin. Welcome, Neil. Congratulations on joining the podcast team.
Thank you very much. Brilliant to be part of it. Thank you for having me.
And just so everyone knows, Neil's also in a by-election at the moment, Neil. So how are your stress levels, energy levels?
It's been fun. Let's put it that way. We had the general election. I almost got into a lot of trouble with my now fiance as well about that because I messed up the dates and I thought I was going to have to cancel said holiday. Was all fine. Thank you, Rishi, for getting that date right. And then we got on holiday, got back, and then the council by-election's just been called in Elgin City South, so we're pretty much right into it. Being up in the north of Scotland, though, the weather's starting to turn already.
So no matter how tired you are at home, folks, Neil might be even more knackered. Although you didn't have council elections in May, so this is you had a slightly easier running. But Sam, let's go with you because we've talked lots about party strategy, about marketing and targeting and messaging. Now, I'm calling this Labour's tactics miserabilism. Now, why is it that Labour have gone so negative so early, in your opinion?
I think it's because they left themselves nowhere to go. I think as a large part of it, they're so committed to just having that level of, we know the Conservatives are going to say this, so we're going to match it so that we don't lose votes. And they've just tied themselves into a position where they just don't have anywhere to go. And so they didn't win. We knew that they were going into the election without a inspirational message. They didn't win on any kind of basis like that. And it turns out they've got into power and they don't have any inspiration. They don't have any big ideas, and they're just following through. And I think as well as that, I think a lot of it is almost Keir Starmer's. This is Keir Starmer's personality. You know, he's not a politician. He's not a great inspirational person, and they knew that. They chose somebody to set the tone for them, who is, you know, competent. He's good at his job. But he's not a leader. He's not an inspirer. He's just a steady as it goes merchant. And the party is kind of following in his footsteps.
I suppose, Neil, from your point of view, I mean, Labour's position during the general election was pretty much say nothing, hopefully the Tories implode. But if you say nothing, it allows other people to write a narrative about you. And I suppose, is that just coming home to roost a little bit for Labour?
I think so. I think even in Scotland, it's quite similar because obviously there's a lot of the kind of devolved issues there too. One of the first things that kind of been said on our own kind of local campaign is that people wanted to vote for Labour because of the whole change mantra. But now they're seeing what that change means. They're like, well, this isn't really change in the sense that we wanted. There's no hope there at all because it's just sounding like, as you were saying, that kind of miserabilism. And I think that is probably the most accurate way to look at it. But I do wonder, I think I agree with Sam as well on this, but I also would maybe add, is it a case that Labour are trying to get in as much of the bad stuff now so that there's still that mantra of, well, we inherited this mess, it was the Conservatives that left it in such a state?
I mean, that's definitely I think their logic and their tactic is to follow the kind of what George Osborne and David Cameron did in 2010, and they did it very successfully. While Labour were having that kind of what do we do now in terms of they in 2010 when after Gordon Brown left, okay, we need a new leader. They left that political landscape completely. Well, they left the pitch basically, and the Tories were able to plant their message that this was all Labour overspending, and they never really got away from it. And it's terrified Labour right away, even up to this election, with their kind of fiscal rules that they're going to have to do. But it is strange, because I want to just talk about how we feel it's going on the doors, because I've done quite a lot of door knocking in this last month, and I think there's a real concern for Labour, because the people, the moderate Tories and the Tory-leaning people really don't like what Labour are doing, but they were never going to. But it's interesting that I was worried that Labour would get, a fairly large honeymoon, and is that going to get in the way of a lot of these, particularly county contests we're going to face next year, or in your by-election now? But it's amazing how reticent or unenthused the Labour voters are, Neil. And I wonder what's it like in your by-election at the moment when you're knocking on doors. Admittedly, Scotland you've got others.
Yeah.
And who's your primary opponent, Neil? That's obviously a really good thing to get over to the audience.
Well, it's an interesting one, because our battle's looking quite free way. We have quite a strong. We're in a really strong Conservative area. It's Douglas Ross's area, but with everything going on there, and there's been more and more drama. He tried to deselect a candidate who ran against me in the general election, which has just come out. So there's been a lot of events happening there. The SNP are obviously in quite a big decline because of their kind of party running. But then Labour probably have got a councillor in the area, but he's got a very large personal vote because he's been there for so long. So it's pretty much all to play for. It really is. It's all the teams are on the pitch. It's just who's going to come out victorious. But in terms of what's kind of coming across kind of on the doorsteps, I think there's a real kind of on goal coming from Labour in terms of there's not really that positive vision at all. And it's leaving that kind of gap for the SNP to say, oh, well, that's just typical Westminster. And you're already seeing their tactic is, oh, they're just the same. They're just red Tories. I mean, Scottish Government's coming out with a whole load of cuts and things because they've been mismanaged for so long. But how that's transcending is there's that apathy. And I remember in the general election, I remember making quite a bold claim with a couple of colleagues saying, look, I think turnout is going to be really particularly low in Moray West and Strathspey, because nobody wants to vote for the SNP, nobody wants to vote for the Tories, and Keir Starmer's not inspiring anyone. And lo and behold, even though quite a few people said I was probably going to be wrong and it'd be high turnout, etc., turnout was really bad. I think it was one of the worst for multiple elections. So I think it's going to really push people even more towards that apathy, because I don't think anybody's really capturing that kind of momentum with those three at the moment.
Sam, what's you obviously have your parliamentary position, but also you're an Oldham councillor. How are you feeling it's coming across the early stages of the Labour government?
I very much the same man. I was at a local councillor. I was at a quilting session this morning, but the anger from the group of pensioners that were there so first of all on winter fuel payments, but then also about the story coming out this morning where, and I haven't seen enough detail on this, but it's the refusal to deny that they're going to cut single person discount. Now, for a group of pensioners, quite a lot of them are on their own because their other half has died.
Yeah.
And suddenly, as a pensioner who's close to the breadline anyway, who'd already been hit by the removal of the winter fuel payments, and then the suggestion that this is going to go, that really is a horrible thing to lose in that situation. Your partner dies, and you're suddenly put in a position where, like, financially, you've only got half of the income, but you've still got the same expenditure. You don't get that reduction. There was a real lot of hostility that I wasn't necessarily. I mean, I expected it. You expect it from what the decision is, but I thought there might be more of a honeymoon. And it is that thing of you have to market yourself both ways. You have to get across that thing of they created this mess. But at the moment, Labour's saying they've created this mess and here's how we're going to get out of it. It's just, here's how we're going to cope. Here's how we're not going to get any worse. That's the wrong message.
There's
You've
no
got to balance it out and take people to where they need to be.
And it was interesting. It's the lack of hope in Labour's messaging that is doing. And it was because we had, as we're recording, we talk about the Tory leadership. Several of the big Tory kind of like Kemi Badenoch, etc., came out yesterday. And what was interesting from Kemi Badenoch's video, obviously there were lots of kind of nods and winks to culture wars and right wing issues, but she did get a little bit more. And David Cameron did this as well. You know, that kind of Britain can be better and we can do that. Now we don't get that from Labour at the moment. And I really wonder, because first impressions really matter. Anyone who, you know, does their campaigning, this is why we say, you know, when you have a new build housing estate, make sure you go to those areas early on, get those first impressions done. It's the same with governments. And for those of us who were around during the coalition, you know, the kind of the omni-shambles budget that then hit the coalition was a very difficult thing to shake off. And I wonder if this is a really dangerous tactic for Labour, Neil. And because how much patience will the government, will the public have? We say, because and you said it before, you said their whole election was based on change, and then it's change, yes, but it's going to be worse, is not something they're going to put up for very long.
It's not quite as catchy as things can only get better, things can only get worse. That seems to be the Starmer mantra. But I think there's probably adding as well, they're also announcing the winter fuel cuts right as we're going into winter, which seems, you know, that in terms of, you know, timing and framing is everything. You know, doing that right now as these things are starting to be on people's minds anyway. I mean, I'm in a part of the country, obviously, where, you know, we're in the most northern reaches up here, where, you know, there is fuel poverty, where there is issues like that. And, you know, we're at early parts of our campaign, but those sort of things are cutting right through. And like Sam was saying, there just isn't that hopeful message. Here's what's going to come as part of that. So I think Rachel Reeves is going to have some interesting framing. I think a lot of people might be drawing a lot of comparisons to George Osborne, that early David Cameron time as well, which I don't think is going to be a very healthy position for Labour to be in. Especially, I mean, looking at local devolved issues and how they're framed, etc., because they'll just be accused of being like the Conservatives.
And I think they're hitting the wrong areas. You know, if you look at who Labour voters should be, you know, that winter fuel payment, like between 10 and 15% of people are keeping it. So if you've got pensioners in poverty, which is in a lot of Labour voting areas is likely to be more, you know, that's people who should be at this point going, oh, thank God, Labour have come in. They've really made a difference for me. And actually, they're turning around and going, they've made things worse for me.
Yeah. It's a very...
I don't understand. There's no counter message. Yeah, there's no counter target. Like you expect them to target somewhat like a traditional Labour, you know, we're going after bankers, we're going after the rich. That's a traditional Labour message. That is just not there. And it feels like Labour are making things worse for the people that they were elected to help.
Yeah, and and I get, okay, let's not try and be, I'm trying not to be too partisan, although I know I am. I know, but in that kind of there is a logic, and we knew beforehand that you want to try and get your worst crap out of the way as soon as possible when you're in government. But I do think their messaging around this is weird. And I think winter fuel payments is a really odd one to pick a fight on, because it isn't a massive amount of money. Yes, it's £1 billion, but they're saying it's out of 22 billion they have to find. I mean, I think if you were to, and that combined with the 2-child cap, obviously that was a little bit of SNP kind of politicking around the King's speech, but they've had 2 tests here, and I think they probably haven't managed either of them very well. And I don't know how Starmer's going to do, because whether that huge majority, Sam, has given him, not cockiness, because I don't think Keir Starmer comes across as a cocky guy, but if you don't have to worry about suspending 7 MPs the week into your government, it is he's in a very powerful position, but that can quickly go. Look at Johnson's 80-seat majority. That went remarkably quickly.
I think I mentioned before, I think that Keir Starmer is somebody who he almost comes across more like a civil servant than a politician. He doesn't seem to be making political judgments. And so I think on winter fuel payments, the way it comes across to me is they said, we want to, you know, I don't have an issue with means testing of winter fuel payments, but it looks like they've tried to rush that policy in And somebody has said, okay, if you want to do it quickly, these are the measures by which you can implement this. And it feels like almost a civil, like somebody not looking at the political picture and just picking off a shelf, okay, this is the easiest way to achieve this saving of money, but not thinking about how it comes across. It's really dour, miserable, and just inconsidered.
And it's also an interesting one because I know with local pictures, I'm not too sure, forgive me, I don't know the Wales local devolved elections, but with the Scottish Parliament election coming up in 2026, whilst there is that frame of time, doing all these worst things now, it just makes the framing for other parties, including our own, to really pick holes in this Labour government. It really does. Because yes, you want to get, as you say, John, the crap out of the way early. I get that. But you look at previous governments like that, even the Johnson era, the Cameron era, the Brown government, the Blair government, they all had a vision. You knew roughly some of the things they wanted to go and do. Where is that with Starmer? That's what I think their biggest issue is going to be.
Yeah, and go on, Sarah. I know you're probably going to talk about narrative and things like that, but that is a really important point, because you can live with pain if you know what the end goal is, and I'm not sure what that end goal is with Labour.
No, and I don't think it didn't even have to be somewhere where they're spending money. Like, you could talk about, we've had this cultural narrative, and Labour could have come in and sort of gone, right, we've got to get the finances sorted out, but we're just going to cut this rubbish out. If you're LGBT plus, if you're a woman who's been suffering from misogyny, on all this narrative around social media, they could have just done a lot of work around positive messaging on how we're going to support people, not in a spending way, but just in a changing that narrative. We want people to feel safe in who they are. And I realise there's some extent to which I think this is a liberal message, and I want those liberal values to be but just saying those things doesn't cost you money. And that opportunity to have that narrative counter to the financial pressures, just go, but we're going, we know what people are, how people have been suffering, how they've been made miserable by this Conservative government. And that wasn't just about the spending, it was about the way that you were undermined as a person. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to inspire you as a person. Well, that doesn't happen. And there's no figure in the current Labour government taking up that mantle.
Neil's just been booted out of his room. Clearly another box of leaflets has just arrived for his by-election. But are we being naive, Sam, with this, in terms of, Labour are wanting to talk tough? They often get hit with economic credibility issues, particularly in general elections versus the Tories. Are we just not seeing it from their side?
I understand why they would want to get that message across. And I think there is part of this that they are doing that they are right to do. But if you remember when Tony Blair's government came in, and I'm slightly older than you, so I probably remember it slightly better, but that was Gordon Brown's job. Gordon Brown's job was to go, financial credibility. I'm doing all the financial credibility. But they had the other message on top of that. They went into that election with Tony Blair saying education, education, education. They had the counter message, and that didn't diminish them addressing the financial responsibility. Now, I think the economy is in a worse position now than it was then, and you have to be aware of that. But it's still, messaging. Sorry, I'm a marketing person. That messaging is wrong. Even if you can't do the finances as well, you didn't have as much financial wiggle room, you can still say the right things and go, this is what we're doing, we're fixing this budget so that this is what we can achieve in the future. They're not even saying it's pain now, but this is what we'll achieve in the future. It's that part is totally missing.
And it's really, so I spoke to a lady who we were canvassing in the last of the Tory strongholds in Preston at the weekend, and there was a Labour former member who I spoke to, and she was great. She was well into her, I would assume, her 80s. She punched me on the shoulder and went, "What is Keir Starmer doing?" And she resigned her membership probably about the start of the year or something like that, just because she didn't have. And this was a Labour member who didn't have buy-in into what Labour was trying to achieve. Now, I said, we can't really criticise much of their general election strategy in terms of getting a huge majority, having had the worst result since the 1930s, the previous one. But we're seeing politics being very much in flux, Neil. And it'd be really interesting to know your opinion, because obviously one of the other big losers in the election was the SNP, and actually how all the opposition parties capitalise on Labour, whether Labour will have a very, very short honeymoon and a quite dramatic fall from grace. I mean, you said about the SNP. I mean, how are the SNP doing in Scotland at the moment?
Oh, it's very much similar to what's happening with the Conservative Party. There is a lot of controversies surrounding the SNP. They just had their national conference actually in Edinburgh for the weekend, I believe. Not that I paid much attention to it, but I think that there's even places where they're not even got a candidate in our local ward yet, which, for an SNP defence ward seems completely bizarre. You would have thought they'd be the first straight out of the gate, yet nobody knows who even their candidate's going to be. I think there's a lot of internal fighting and jostling for position. There's a lot of blame being put in different ways and means, and it's not a happy camp over there. And I think the messaging seems to be from them that they're just painting, and it's pretty easy to paint. I mean, Sam talked really well about the narrative there, and all opponents are doing it, painting the Starmer government as very, very similar to the Conservative government. And because there's not those kind of hope messages and there's not these kind of real positive things that they want to do, it's leaving opportunity for opponents. I mean, look, you mentioned it earlier, you're talking about the Conservative leadership in these speeches. In times gone by, when they had a lot of these candidates, they weren't even making the headlines because it was so early in that leadership election. Yet because nothing's really happening, it's just this dour miserabilism. There's really opportunity there that's being left by the Starmer government. And I mean, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, I suppose, a wee bit here. Like we shouldn't criticise too much. Don't interrupt them when they're making these mistakes. But if you're Anna Sarwar and you're the Scottish Labour Party, you got to be worrying about those kind of narratives very quickly when you're already getting the attacks from the Scottish National Party and others about them being just the branch office or these kind of factors.
And I think of when Blair and Brown got in '97. So obviously Sam was right. The economic legacy of the John Major and Ken Clarke gave them a kind of a golden inheritance to which to go on to. But what Labour did, because Labour were actually really specific in their policies for that election, even though it was class sizes under 30, they were quite specific, and they did for 2 years keep to the Conservative fiscal rule. But one of the things they did do very early on is do big, bold things to try and. So obviously the Bank of England being made independent was the big move there, saying, right, we are a sensible party for a modern Britain. We are not the old leftist party. What are their big plans now? Obviously, we think, and Sam will no doubt, as now a parliamentary assistant, will get things. Whether things like the new railway nationalisation bill is going to be big, but it's going. Wouldn't you have done that first? And then people would have went, oh, hang on. Keir Starmer's not messing about. And then what they've done is done two really awkward, awful things first, which has just set the tone against them, Sam.
Yeah. I mean, and that is, they have got things that they could take up and seize and put forward. I mean, railways is just such a convoluted mess, and I wonder if they were nervous about it because it wasn't a simple policy. It's complicated. There's a lot of money that will need to go into it. It's working out how they're going to sort these contracts, and I wonder if they held off because they just went, well, we need to get this right and we need to actually go through it, and they didn't have a simple idea. Whereas the Bank of England is not as complicated a thing. It needs setting up, but it's not like national infrastructure, biggest thing. And they needed something different. I also think I want to, the counter to their election campaign, and at the time we were very different about it. Ed Davies' position as the counter to that miserabilism, like he was anything but miserable, and I think it's really showed what a good strategy that was. Because we can now sort of tone it down a bit. We don't have to be that, oh my God, all like big shouting, but just being positive, having that level of we can be the people inspiring people there is an opportunity there, not just to criticise Labour, but actually to step into that. And we're in the right position to do that.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. And I shared with the WhatsApp, I didn't give any personal details away, but I showed in the podcast WhatsApp a survey response we had from one of these areas that said, and I can't remember what they said they voted for in the general election, but they basically said at the next local elections, which for us is the 2025 counties, make sure everyone get your selection sorted, get your plans in place. That's a little hint there. And it said, who were you thinking of voting for at the next local elections? And this was an absolute dyed-in-the-wall kind of Tory area. And you had to tick, who would you consider? Lib Dem, Green, Reform. And it's that kind of, they are looking for something else. And I do wonder, like I say, it's a really interesting point of where Labour, because I think the Tories, it will get worse for the Tories before it gets better. And I think regardless of the leadership, I think James Cleverly is probably the most Keir Starmer-esque, boring, settling the ship kind of guy. I think everyone else in that Tory leadership is either, is probably going to help us. Not as much as Liz Truss helped us, but still is probably, I'm not fearful of. Go on, Neil.
Well, I mean, it seems to be this complete race to the bottom. I know Sam talked really well about narrative there, and I think it's really quite key. And what's happening with that Conservative Party, there's that race to the bottom in terms of how right can we go to get back Reform voters. And we've seen a couple of survey responses ourselves up this way, and couldn't be more further removed from an area up in the north of Scotland. And it does seem that vote isn't being very pro-Nigel Farage or being in that kind of ultra-right mindset. It is literally just the ultimate protest vote. It represents something completely different and it stands out. And, as much as we're not in that camp, Reform capitalised on that. They really did. And they had X amount of media coverage because of Farage and who he is. But if they want to continue to go on to this race to the far right to get back voters, I think they're going to get a real sharp awakening, even in particular, again, in Scotland. That's not going to fly up here. I mean, there's a Scottish leadership contest going on as well. I believe they've narrowed it down to 3 candidates, and they seem to even be flirting a wee bit more farther to the right than what you'd expect. But with the kind of demographics that are in Scotland, that's going to be a real wake-up call when they see in 2026 and their votes going even further backwards from where it already was.
And and just to finish off on the winter fuel payments thing, you have to give credit for those who don't know Tim Pixton. He's the chief exec of LDC, and so technically my boss, but I would say this regardless, that as soon as winter fuel payments announcement was made, it was made over like a Friday or a weekend, and I hadn't picked up on it at the time. And he came in on Monday, and his political instincts were spot on. He said, that is going to be an issue for Labour. And we immediately at ALDC started coming up with a draft notice of motions for councils and press releases, things like that. And I will say, when I go on the doors, I don't kind of prompt people for any sort of issue. I don't go on there and say, oh, what do you think of Labour on this winter fuel issue or anything like that. It is naturally coming up a lot on the door. It has had a real cut through. And bearing in mind now, Sam, the Lib Dems and leadership have now come out and criticised it, and I've joined in with the charities and the Conservatives and probably the SNP and most other opposition parties in saying this is a ham-fisted way of doing it, and it's a bad policy, and you haven't quite figured this out right. How far will the Lib Dems go on attacking Labour, and when will they do it? Because we've already had briefings, we want to finish off the job and replace the Tories is kind of basically and get rid of the last of the Tory MPs. But at some point we are going to have to deal with Labour, because a lot of us have county seats that now have, which are Lib Dem versus Tory, but now have Labour MPs. And that is going to be a dynamic that we are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting because I said at the start, like Labour have brought in policies which damage their own chances. And actually it's meant that we can attack them in a way that is constructive in Conservative areas. Yeah. Like the fact that winter fuel payments is affecting pensioners. Well, actually, a lot of the voters that we want to take off Conservatives are those pensioners.
Yeah.
So at the moment, there are ways in which we're able to attack Labour and that helps us in those kind of blue-facing seats. It'll be interesting to see what happens when Labour are doing things that are not, are harder to constructively attack in a Conservative-facing area.
Because obviously in Hazel Grove, which you now work for, and obviously I spent all polling day on getting the wonderful Lisa Smart elected, Labour came second in there, which I was surprised at that. I mean, on polling day, I got a little bit of a squeaky bum when I was hearing people saying they were going to vote Labour instead of voting for Lisa when I was doing some of the door knocking. But this is the other issue: is what happens to that big chunk of Labour votes there? That because obviously Labour was riding high in polls and everything else. So how do you deal with it in places like Hazel Grove, where you now have to squish Labour but also not let the Tories get momentum?
I mean, it's an issue that we've had for a while because we've got a Labour-facing council. There are no Conservative councillors. So we went into the election in the position that you're describing. We had a Conservative MP, we had a Labour-facing council. And so we were the whole way through looking to balance that out. I mean, it'll be a lot of it will kind of come down to where the Conservatives manage to get in 4 years' time. Because at this point, the Conservatives, I mean, they'd given up on campaigning in Hazel Grove. There were more Labour posters in a Conservative-held seat when they were third and a long way third than there were. They weren't out door knocking. Now, in 4 years' time, that's likely to be a very different situation. It is clearly possible to, that's the message that we had to kind of come out with. And I think Labour's miserabilism will help with that, because if you're kind of fighting in two directions, the fact that the one who almost could take your message of hope isn't doing will make it easier.
I think I would tend to also echo some of the bits that Sam was saying as well, especially fighting a by-election in what is a multi-member ward with a Labour councillor. There is that miserabilism that we can definitely exploit. I mean, the Labour councillors recently voted through a Murray Council budget, which cut a lot of services, put taxes up, etc., and it hurt people on the ground. And that's something that's really kind of cutting through. So the thing we're keeping on saying right now is that we're fed up of Murray Council making news for the wrong reasons, and that narrative, it plays it shows how the Conservative administration is pretty lackluster. It shows that the SNP administration before it also mismanaged it, and the Labour councillors are just voting through these budgets, and despite promising things like brown bin charges, they got put up to one of the joint highest in Scotland, and yet they said they weren't going to do that. So there is definitely openings there, and I think it's really quite an interesting time to now be going and doing these campaigns now. And on that point on ALDC that you mentioned as well, John, that was a really good piece of work. It was a really right issue as well. It had real cut through. And I'm probably one of the ones that really benefit from it, because there was that press release pack. We put it out to our local media. We put in our local narrative about it. And it's been sitting at one of the top of our local paper's digital platform for the entire weekend there. And that's just after we announced our candidate. So it's been a really good issue to pick up on and really hold them to account.
And I think one thing, I mean, you'll get this one. I'll bring you in a second, Sam. Is that you've obviously had myself and Hannah Kitchen, who are Labour facing generally, as being the kind of stalwarts of, yes, the party is taking a lot of seats off the Tories in the general election, etc. But actually, we can't give Labour a free ride, and they deserve to be scrutinised and challenged and beaten, because that's what we're in this game for. We want more Lib Dems. But I do wonder if some of the Lib Dems in areas where Labour aren't particularly strong, a kind of a southern, more moderate Labour, rather than some of the anger red brick throwing people that we get up here, that actually you are going to have an uncomfortable because we all want. And I'll be honest with you, I want Keir Starmer to do well. I want the country to be better than what we've had. But it doesn't mean you give him a free pass. And it doesn't mean you let him get away with stupid decisions. And I think, Sam, that's what our job has got to be as Lib Dems going forward.
Well, you mentioned at the start about, they've kicked the can down the road on social care. And they've also, in terms of local government funding, nothing is going to come the way of local government. And if you addressed social care, you might get away with not giving extra funding to local government. But the fact that those two have not been addressed at all and are not going to be addressed, those are clearly not going to get picked up for some time. Well, that means that the next round of budgets for local councils are going to be extraordinarily depressing. There's going to be cuts across the board. There's going to be services lost, and that's going to be particularly bad in Labour areas.
Councils go bust.
Yeah, I mean, we have on Oldham, we've got £42 million left in reserves, and we're £25 million overspent this year, or budgeting for £25 million overspend. We've got 18 months of money left. Labour are going to, if they're not careful, oversee a swathe of local councils just running out of money. And in terms of how they then go into local elections, county elections, and in 4.5 years' time, a general election, having that message, we've talked about financial responsibility.
It also then you have to look at that Barnett formula, the consequentials there, and then looking at how that then trickles down to Wales, and trickles to Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. There's a lot of issues that are going to be coming up with these sort of issues, with these sort of decision making, and I just don't see where. I don't think there's a long-term strategy there, because I don't think councils going bust and more local devolved governments having to make cuts. Yes, that will also hurt the SNP because their mismanagement has been awful too, but it's going to hurt Labour too.
Yeah. And I think that's where we're probably going to leave today's episode, but it is really important. I mean, for a couple of things from the campaigning point of view, I very briefly said it before, 2025 is a really great opportunity for the Lib Dems, a genuinely great one. Because as a county councillor myself, I scraped through by 100 and something odd votes because 2021 was so terrible and it was such a good year for the Tories that the chances of us in really strong areas with a Labour government that's growing unpopular, a Tory party in shambles, we are the only people, or we're the best people to capitalise on that in all these county seats. So get your plans together, get those marked registers bought from the general election, get your campaign, start knocking on doors before Christmas. Really, we'll start knocking on doors now, but do as many as you can before Christmas, because there is a great opportunity there. We'll also, for those who think, we've got conference coming up at the time of recording. That is just over a week away. The Lib Dem podcast has its first fringe with ALDC talking about the county election. So we will be recording that live. Yours truly is on the panel. So if you don't get enough of my lovely dulcet tones and advice, you can have it live. But also, I don't know how many other people from the podcast. Also, we've got lots of MPs coming, but do come and say hello, me and Sam. We won't promise to buy you a drink because the conference bar prices are way too expensive, but actually come and say hello. It will be great to see you in Brighton in just over a week, because actually this year has been a great one for the Lib Dems in terms of gaining more councils, gaining more councillors, a wonderful general election, and a brilliant opportunity ahead of us. So I'm really optimistic. I think this could be a great year, great 12 months for the Lib Dems. So thank you, Neil, who obviously the next big victory, I've mentioned all those greats, is you winning. That clearly needs to be the one. So if you are in Scotland, go and help. I don't care where you are, go and help. And we'll be back with more episodes with Sam, Neil, the team, and myself in the future. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll be back again very soon.